Okay, so I want to talk about the hitboxes. I'm recording this after talking about them prior, but I have a whole different topic about them now, and I feel like this is important to get out of the way first, because I want to talk about this by starting with something in the patch notes that really confused me, and that was the patch note change for V-Blaster. I was really confused when I saw that they shaved 2 frames off of its end lag, because V-Blaster is rather infamous, if you know your Splatoon 2 history, for being too overbuffed in that aspect. It got a 7-frame buff in Splatoon 2, and it became super meta at the time. It's the reason why it has a smaller blast radius now, is because that's how they balanced around that. So the fact that they went to such an extreme buff, and were willing to not just let it stay, but actually make it even more insane, just felt a little bit crazy to me. Why V-Blaster of all things with that kind of change? But I think the hitbox changes are the actual reason. So, what's the point of the hitbox changes? Obviously, it was a little bit talked about that it was, like the motion controls that people got better at, yada yada yada. I don't think that's the real reason. I think there's a balanced reason behind this as well. And I think it has to do with short-range weapons. Short-range weapons tend to be some of the real winners of this hitbox change, for a very simple reason. They tend to have larger ones. They also benefit because a lot of short-range weapons have access to high mobility, or the ability to go in and out of squid form more easily, where their hitbox is understandably going to be smaller. So the changes for short-range weapons make it so that they have an easier time getting in, but also once they get in, they have an easier time landing shots and finding kills. And if you look at the history of the meta, it's not too hard to see why in this game. Mid-range and backline weapons have done very well, and short-range weapons have been struggling, especially short-range fighting weapons. Doppelduely is like the only good example of a short-range fighting weapon that's super active right now, though there are other exceptions like rollers that we occasionally see. That's like the only more traditional one, I should say. And this buff seems like it's looking to address and change that, because in addition to that, a lot of these other mid or backline weapons are going to be a bit harder, mainly due to the fact that not only are they shooting at opponents who have access to a smaller hitbox and better mobility, but also because many of these weapons are slow. Think about rollers in their flicks, sloshers when they're shooting, or blasters when they're shooting. These are all weapons that have a large amount of time spent in human form, and are therefore going to be more susceptible. When a short-range weapon gets in, it's going to be so much easier for them to land a shot on a mid-range weapon versus a mid-range weapon trying to land their shot on them. And I believe that all of that, as awkward as it might feel at first, and maybe a little too far in some places like Dapple and Spray Shooter hitbox sizes, is the actual intended outcome of the whole thing. And it's in that aspect, right, that I find this change being very interesting. Because I think the devs themselves were actually worried about the ramifications about this ahead of time. Not just in the fact that there's another patch, but I think it also explains a lot of the changes. Why did Dynamo get stealth revived in this update? Why did Tri-Slosher finally get buffed after so long? And to go back to the start of this video, why did V-Blaster get this end lag change? V-Blaster, I think, is the best example before I talk about the other two. Because reducing the amount of time you're spending in human form suddenly makes a lot of sense if it's known for trying to check weapons that are also short range. Weapons that would be exploiting its lack of time in human form. Suddenly Blaster having this stupid lack of end lag actually lines up a lot with how short-range weapons operate. Having faster access to squid form so it's not as large a target, is important to allow this weapon to be a counter to it. And Blaster's main job is to be a check for short-range weapons. It's not terrible into mid-range, but even with the buff, people have realized that, yeah, it's probably not going to be great into double midline comps. But that's not the point. V-Blaster is supposed to be good into short-range options. Tri-Slosher is another example. The main weapon already does this pretty well, it didn't really need a hitbox change, so instead they took its biggest problem and toned it back a little bit. And then of course Dynamo Roller is known for being a short-range check, and its primary buff was paint and increasing the range of the horizontal flick to outrange short-range weapons. Dynamo Roller is known particularly for checking those weapons and struggling against mid to backline options. So buffing it in a way that it deals with these weapons, again, feels very intentional. And it's not just that these weapons deal with the short-range weapons in the way that they're buffed by having ways of dealing with it. it's also that these comps force other short range to deal with it. V-Blaster is not a mid-range weapon. Tri-Slosher is not a mid-range weapon. And if Dynamo seems like an exception, not only does Dynamo lose to mid-range weapons, but it's probably taking the slot of one of them. The huge lack of mobility means something else in your team is probably going to turn into a short-range weapon. And I think that that's a really important thing to point out, because I think Nintendo wants to change the game so that the counters to short-range weapons are more focused around being other short-range weapons. This isn't to say that there aren't midlines that do a good job at fighting short-range weapons. I mean, Bucket is an insane weapon right now and probably better in this patch because it's going to be the best midline weapon at doing that. But pretty much every other mid-range weapon is going to be worse in a short range. S-Blast has the AoE nerf that it got on top of all this. Mint Decapitator is just easier to hit when it's doing its dash slashes. Wiper is easier to hit when it's standing and walking around. Even rollers are going to be easier to hit in their flicks if you're using something like normal roller or carbon. Though they're definitely affected a lot less, and hey, maybe this also explains why roller got a small little compensation buff for this, right? In general, I think that's also the whole point of why aura buffs are the way they are. While they do help some mid-range weapons in aspects like intensify action for blasters, and again, every weapon gets something out of aura to some extent, it does primarily benefit short-range weapons by making them more mobile and hard to hit. I feel like this is just the general trend. Outside of just trying to make short-range weapons better, they're also trying to make them more fighting-focused and trying to incentivize counters to them that encourage other short-range weapons. That said, short-range weapons can still deal with midline options, and I don't think midlines are going to change very much. But what I do think is going to change is if you're a typical double midline comp and you're fighting a double short-range team, it might be worth changing one of those midlines, or at least one weapon in your comp, to be a weapon like Dynamo, or Tri-Slosher, or Roller, or Blaster, or something else that is short-range that also deals with short-range. And I think this dynamic is pretty important. Short-range weapons have not been healthy in this game. They have been some of the most unhealthy weapons in the entire series because they've had to depend and rely on special spamming. While the buffs to some of these weapons like shooters might seem repetitive, and they were in a game like Splatoon 2, here I think it's really important. We have to make them play in a way that's more fun and interactive, and this feels like it's dealing with that. Mid-range weapons are great for the game. The increased fighting focus is something that I really enjoy and want to see more of. But I think it is also fair to point out that we tend to just be slowly creeping towards larger and larger range values in overall team compositions, and short-range weapons are a part of the game that needs to be shown off and important. So to me, I think it is very important for these kind of changes to address that, and I think that this might encourage a little bit more counterpicking and variety. There are other effects on the hitbox changes that I plan to get to in the other video I have already scripted, but I think it's worth pointing out that I truly believe that this is the overall direction. They want short range to feel the way they do, they want mid-range weapons to feel like they have a harder time hitting these kinds of weapons, but they're also looking out to make sure that this doesn't just lead to having a bunch of short-range weapons. They have also addressed and buffed the counters to these options while ensuring that even with these counters, short-range weapons are still good. If I'm right about all this, and I think I am, then that's a lot of forward thinking, and I really am excited for it. I don't know how this meta is going to develop, but the devs are clearly ready with a fast patch to respond to it. So we'll see if this kind of direction plays off. It's a bit of a gamble, but it's one I'm pretty excited for. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you all next time.